Picture Hungary in the early 20th century, a place of political upheaval and underground Marxist movements. Out of this moment came György Lukács, one of the most influential Marxist philosophers and literary critics of the century. Born in 1885, Lukács worked as a revolutionary, a theorist, and an intellectual who shaped what later became known as Western Marxism. His most famous book, History and Class Consciousness, published in 1923, is central for your exam prep. Asked in exam. In this work, Lukács emphasized the idea of class consciousness, the awareness of workers as a collective revolutionary force. Drawing from Marx and Hegel, he argued that history could only be transformed when theory and practice united. But Lukács didn't just stop at politics. He also transformed literary criticism. In the theory of the novel, first written in 1916, he introduced the haunting phrase transcendental homelessness. By this, he meant that the modern human condition is marked by displacement and longing, and that the novel became the epic form best suited to capture this modern experience. Lukács often clashed with fellow Marxists. He dismissed thinkers like Theodor Adorno as living in what he called the Grand Hotel Abyss, a comfortable retreat from real revolutionary struggle. For Lukács, literature was not meant to be abstract or detached. It had to reveal contradictions in society and connect individual lives to larger social forces. This is why he distinguished between critical realism and socialist realism. Critical realism, he argued, was achieved by writers like Balzac, Walter Scott, and Tolstoy, writers who portrayed life truthfully and in all its complexity. Such works exposed contradictions and advanced progressive values. Socialist realism, in his view, was the logical extension of this literature that linked personal experience to the totality of social life under socialism. Remember Engels' remark about Balzac embodying the triumph of realism? Lukács placed it at the heart of his literary theory. In essays like Kafka or Thomas Mann, he pushed this further, contrasting what he saw as decadent modernism with the socially engaged realism of writers like Mann. We have already explored some of the most influential thinkers in Marxist theory in Chapter 7, Antonio Gramsci with his concept of cultural hegemony and the philosophy of praxis, E.P. Thompson with his history from below and working class consciousness, and the Frankfurt School's critical theory with its analysis of the culture industry. There, we also examined the ideas of Theodor Adorno and Max Horkheimer, as well as Jürgen Habermas and his notions of communicative rationality and the public sphere. Since these figures have been discussed in detail earlier, we will not repeat them here, but continue by focusing on other voices within the landscape of Western Marxism. When you think of the Frankfurt School, names like Adorno, Horkheimer, and Habermas usually come to mind. But one figure became especially popular in the 1960s for his radical ideas about freedom and liberation, that was Herbert Marcuse. Born in Germany in 1898, Marcuse studied under Martin Heidegger in Freiburg, completing a dissertation on Hegel in 1932. Soon after, he emigrated to the United States, where he became one of the most influential critical theorists of the post-war era. Marcuse is best remembered for two books, Eros and Civilization, published in 1955, asked in exam, and One-Dimensional Man, published in 1964, asked in exam. These works cemented his role as what many call the philosopher of the New Left. In Eros and Civilization, Marcuse brought together Marxist critique with Freudian psychoanalysis. Drawing on Freud's Civilization and its discontents from 1930, he argued that capitalist societies repress instinctual desires, especially erotic energies. Instead of living freely, human beings are forced into a life shaped by productivity, control, and repression. But here's where Marcuse takes a hopeful turn. He imagined the possibility of a non-repressive civilization, one where play, creativity, and desire could be liberated from capitalist domination. This vision deeply inspired the counterculture of the 1960s, from student protests to the early gay liberation movement. Now, let's turn to One-Dimensional Man. In this book, Marcuse widened his critique, targeting not only advanced capitalism but also Soviet communism. He argued that both systems produce conformity by absorbing the working class into cycles of consumerism and technological rationality. This, he said, neutralized revolutionary potential. Remember this carefully. Marcuse's notion of one-dimensionality described how ideology, technology, and consumer culture flatten society into conformity, leaving little space for resistance or alternative possibilities. So when you think of Herbert Marcuse, keep these anchors in mind: Eros and civilization asked in exam, one-dimensional man asked in exam, and the idea of liberation from repression and one-dimensionality. Together, they made him one of the most radical and hopeful voices of the Frankfurt School. Picture the early 20th century, a world marked by war, new technologies, and social upheaval. In the midst of it all stands Walter Benjamin, a German Jewish philosopher, essayist, and cultural critic, whose writings continue to shape the way we think about art, literature, and history. Benjamin's thought combined German idealism, Romanticism, Western Marxism, and even Jewish mysticism. His friendships played a vital role in shaping his ideas. He was deeply influenced by playwright Bertolt Brecht and by Gershom Scholem, a Kabbalah scholar. These relationships also connected him to the Frankfurt School and to Jewish intellectual traditions, something that has been asked in exam. Pause here and note this Benjamin's most famous essay, The Work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction, 1935, argued that modern technologies like photography and film changed the very meaning of art. They stripped away its traditional aura, that sense of uniqueness tied to original works, but at the same time, they made art more democratic, accessible, and politically powerful. Another central text is his thesis on the philosophy of history from 1940. In it, Benjamin describes the haunting image of the angel of history who is blown into the future while staring helplessly at the wreckage of the past. It's a profound metaphor for the tragedies of modernity and the violent progress of history. Benjamin also wrote extensively as a literary critic with essays on Goethe, Baudelaire, Kafka, Proust, and Lescaut. In The Storyteller, he famously declared that every story contains something useful asked in exam. For him, stories weren't just entertainment, they carried communal, ethical, and practical wisdom. Tragically, Benjamin's life ended in 1940 when he committed suicide at the Spanish border while fleeing Nazi persecution, but his work lived on. His friend Hannah Arendt later edited Illuminations in 1968, Asked in Exam, a collection that preserved many of his most influential essays and became a gateway into his thought for future generations. So when you think of Walter Benjamin, remember these anchors: his connection with Brecht and Scholem, the work of art in the age of mechanical reproduction, thesis on the philosophy of history, the storyteller, asked in exam, and Illuminations, asked in exam. His legacy lies in showing us that art, politics, and history are never separate. They are always intertwined, shaping how we understand both culture and ourselves.